Welcome to the Visible Art of Translation podcasts. This series of podcasts are part of the EU-funded INCREC project. Our focus is creativity, translation, and technology in literary and audiovisual translation. Our goal with this series is to give visibility to the often invisible skills, role, and voice of professional translators. Hello, everyone. Today is a bit of a special podcast because we are not interviewing a translator, but a computer scientist. Alon Lavie is a computer scientist and an expert on machine translation, and he has been at the leading edge of AI research in language technology for more than 20 years. I listened to a Slater podcast, I don't know if you are all familiar with it, where Alon Lavie discussed the state of the art on machine translation, and I thought it was a good idea to interview him in our podcast. Thank you very much, Alon, for accepting our invitation, and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
My pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be here, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation. So my name is indeed Alon Lavie. I'm currently a distinguished career professor at the Language Technologies Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. I've actually been on the faculty here at Carnegie Mellon University for almost 30 years. But for the last 10 years, after being a full-time professor, I took a partial break from academia. I remained engaged here in a distinguished adjunct role. And I was for 10 years in senior management roles on the industry side on the development of machine translation and language technologies. And then I came back in a full-time capacity to my university role last fall, helping to run our professional master program in AI and innovation. So in addition to that, Anna mentioned, in my career, I've mostly worked on translation technologies, language technologies more broadly, machine translation technologies. But maybe what I'm most known for is for developing state-of-the-art technologies on automating translation quality evaluation, particularly evaluating machine translation quality automatically. But with more recent technology, I think these methods are being applied and are relevant for evaluating translation quality more broadly, whether it's produced by machines, whether it's produced by machines and then edited by humans, or whether it's generated by humans directly or in collaboration with machines. So particularly, I spearheaded or initiated the development of a metric called METEOR in the early 2000s that was used quite extensively, both for machine translation and for other language technologies, as it turns out. And then more recently, 5 years ago, while I was the VP of Language Technologies at Babel, my team developed COMET, which is a neural machine translation, automated translation quality evaluation measure that was adopted and very broadly across the industry to evaluate neural and then LLM, generative AI-based machine translation systems. And most recently, well, I've been involved actually in the WMT. Anna, you mentioned the WMT evaluations, and I was indeed on the Slater podcast where Tom Kochmi and I talked about this. But I've been involved in an annual shared task on automated translation quality evaluations or QE systems or MT metrics for the last 10 years. And last year, we merged two separate shared tasks in WMT, one with reference-based metrics and the other with called quality estimation technology, into one common task that's about automated translation quality evaluation. And I was the lead coordinator for that organizing team and for that shared task. And that's really what I talked about on the Slater podcast. So let me stop here maybe on the introductions of part.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think maybe I should tell our listeners that these shared tasks in WMT are, in a way, they showcase or they decide this WMT, which are the best machine translation engines at that moment in time. We know this changes
Right.
very quickly, but at that time, for different, say, domains or genres, it's divided and decided. And literary translation, and this is one of the topics of our podcast, is also evaluated in the WMT. And what has always surprised me is that sometimes, not always, in these conferences, there is this claim that some MT models or some now large language models almost achieve human parity in literary translation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, we will discuss more about this. What makes a translation, in your opinion, outstanding, even if it is machine translation? What are the characteristics that for you or your field are important?
Yeah. So I think it comes down to the contextual understanding of what we mean by outstanding. And I think in my view or my interpretation of it is that in addition to being high fidelity, meaning, faithful to the source and completely fluent in the target language, it satisfies, and its outstanding translation has to satisfy some additional criteria, which are actually much more application domain dependent. So in literature translation, I would imagine it has to be specifically you want to measure some level of engagement and of novelty or capturing some maybe subtle, latent kind of characteristics in the source language. In other kinds of domains, it has to have maybe other characteristics. So in communication domains, it might need to be easy for the listener or for the receiver to understand the content. Imagine, for example, communication or translation that's given to medical patients when they don't speak the language of their medical providers, then you want to make sure that they actually really understand what the doctor was trying to communicate to them. So it has to be easy to understand in addition to being, correct and accurate, that maybe the medications are exactly translated correctly and the right dosages and things of that nature. And I can imagine in other domains, maybe technical domains, terminology is really, important, and subtleties related to terminology is important. In marketing content, you want the culture and the voice and the branding to come across in very particular ways. So I don't think there's a fully formal definition or certainly not a uniform definition of what it means for a translation to be outstanding, but there are kind of some basics that are essential in all applications and use cases, and then there are use case and application specific things that are different.
And in line with this, with what is that makes quality or something outstanding, in INCREC, we are working and testing creativity, right? We are interested in
Yes,
creativity in literary translation and audiovisual
right.
translation. And we have seen that the latest models, GPT or even other models, are less creative than professional translators. And this is especially aggravated when the same translators post edit text, because
Hmm.
somehow their creative process is altered by
Right.
having to look at something that is already there. So we haven't really seen that these new models, in a way, can offer even human parity or at all. So
Hmm.
do you think that technology can evolve in a way that these outstanding translations can be augmented? Because this has also been discussed quite a lot in translation studies, if technology can augment people, and how can this be so it doesn't constrain their creativity? Is there a way to do this? Is technology interested on this, or is mainly to always to substitute translators?
I think there is a path forward. I think there are capabilities, and I think we're kind of on the verge of some significant paradigm shifts that are required in order to actually enable the effective use of the latest emerging technology in addressing those barriers that you kind of indicated in your question. So I think if I were to summarize the dimensions on which I think these developments are likely to happen over the next couple of years, I would use like three terms. One is adaptability, the other is interactivity, and the third might be sort of flexibility in terms of like kind of relates to interactivity. But so let me explain what I mean by that. I think the way things have typically been done in the past, and I think that's kind of too limited in order to test and then extrapolate from, is to ask a machine to generate a draft translation
Mm-hmm.
and then basically use that as to hand that over to a human translator and expect the human then to take that full draft and just edit it and turn it into the final product that is comparable or basically equivalent in terms of the delivery to what another translator might have done from scratch. Because the technology basically was, this is kind of the fossilized or the fixed workflow that everyone has been familiar with based on evolving technology in the past. And the wrong thing to do, or to evaluate even at this point in time where we are right now, is to take a model like any of the latest generative AI models. It can be, GPT-5 or Gemini 3.0, and to follow this same process, basically to ask with just limited prompting, the model as it is basically, as it's offered, kind of generically through the UI or the API to generate a translation, in this case, of a piece of literature, maybe, a chapter or several paragraphs at a time or something like that, and then take the output of that and hand that over to a translator and say, post-edit this or review this and post-edit this and see what comes out. So there's several problems with doing that. So that I'm saying that's the wrong way to do it because it's missing out on the latest innovations really that these models are capable of doing that have not yet quite made it into, that I'll be upfront about that, into well-known and established and tested products that can do
Mm-hmm.
things differently. But basically what these models that are emerging now can do along the dimensions that I mentioned. So first of all, adaptability. So they are capable now of learning or adapting at translation time with what's called instructional learning to very, very detailed contextual information. So if you were to actually ask it to generate a translation, the right thing to do already now would be to supply it with a lot of specialized knowledge that is necessary in order to do literature translation, including not just the source of what you wanted to translate, but a lot of information that translators that are doing literature translation are preparing themselves or have, over a long period of time in order to do that type of task, including characteristics of other texts by this author in the source language about what it means to do literature translation and what type of creativity are you actually looking for, including background materials around the topic of the actual book that is being translated, along many different background materials. All of that can be supplied basically at translation time, not building, for days or weeks or months, a dedicated translation system that is specialized to do this, but basically before you actually do just the translation that you want to do of a piece of literature, providing much, much deeper levels of contextual and background information to instruct the automated system, the AI system here, how to actually do a translation. So that's the adaptability side.
If I may interrupt here, because
Yeah,
I
of
think
course.
this is quite important. We have tested more detailed prompting and it didn't work out that well for us. A bit of reasoning worked out a bit better if we ask the model to kind of reason every step. But I think the question that many translators would ask you if they were listening to this adaptability, was this part,
Yeah,
is
adaptability.
if I have to write, because when you translate literature, it's not only the broader context, right? In a book,
Yeah.
every author has a voice, yes, but also every book has certain peculiarities. And where translators really spend time is sometimes in what we call these units of creative potential or these problems, right? So a translator would say, well, if I have to provide all this contextual information for every single thing that I encounter, then what I might as well do it myself. This is what,
Yes,
they might say.
fair enough. And I think what we don't quite know yet is it possible to automate this adaptability that I called it, by bringing
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of this background information? Is it possible to automate that process so that the translators don't actually have to do it all themselves from scratch? That's where a lot of the automation is going to come in. And again, I will be very upfront that I don't think that there are specialized systems quite yet that do this automation or that are set up basically to make the life of a translator working on literature translation easy, but that's coming. I think that this is something that is going to develop quite
Okay.
quite significantly over the next couple of years because the capabilities of the actual underlying AI system to incorporate and adjust what it's producing is remarkable. Remarkable. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that translators typically have a sense of how remarkable that is. But I want to address the second dimension, which is the
Yes.
interactivity. So rather than basically generating a complete translation of a text, and then the translator sitting down and post-editing it or reviewing it and making those changes, the idea would be to interact with that AI system in a much more engaged and ongoing basis. So you might actually start with just a paragraph or a chapter. And after you've done this initial, hopefully automated or largely automated adaptation, to get the translation system already geared, aligned with what you wanted to do. And then you review just maybe the first couple of paragraphs and you see some trends in there of things that it didn't do perfectly well. Maybe, the language isn't creative enough. Maybe it's not formal enough. Maybe there's other characteristics. So you can now go back and engage with that AI system and say, tell it what about the text, not by post-editing the entire book or large portions of it, but by samples of it, looking and actually engaging and giving feedback to the AI system and asking it to actually address those deficiencies and generate a new draft. And again, I'm not claiming that these processes are fully worked out,
I
and whether
want to
this,
say something there as well, because
yeah,
this interactivity, I think some translators might use it to play a little bit if they are stuck. But what I have seen in the results is that you would need to interact with every single sentence to make it, especially with, I'm going to say high literature, but with,
hmm
quite good literature. I don't know if this sounds
yeah,
too bad, but let's say books that have a lot of units of creative potential, to be more scientific.
yes,
So if I am interacting with almost every sentence to make it really appealing, it will be able to mimic me in the rest of the sentences, say, right?
yeah, hmm
But then I have to say that the way the publishing industry, which is kind of very close on how they use this, but we know a little bit more from the technical side of things, they offer discounts because they are using machine translation. I don't see how this adaptability and interactivity benefits paying less for it. If anything,
yeah,
you pay more
yeah.
because I'm helping also the machines. You know what I mean? How do
Well,
you see that this will help literary translators that are already not very highly paid?
yeah.
How is this going to help them is also a question, right?
I think the concern around business models and adapting business models to fit this changing way of interacting with technology is a very valid concern. And we've been to this movie before in domains where machine translation had more immediate impact and success, like technical translation. So,
Sure.
you know, when the model of machine translation plus post-editing started becoming mainstream, maybe 10 years ago, there were very similar types of problems and similar concerns about, that the the translators were being pushed. Basically, the issue is that, there was a long skepticism, and it was a valid skepticism, right? That whether, in fact, letting a machine translate text and then asking translators to post-edit it was, in fact, more efficient, productive, and generating as good or better quality at the end of the day, that warranted basically paying them under a different model or paying them less
Mm.
than paying, the
Which
rates
is
for.
still an ongoing discussion, to be
It
honest.
is,
Even though I think what we said initially, those 10 or 20 years ago, when I also started working with machine translation, is that it all depended on the quality of the output, right?
that's right. That's right. And because it's so difficult to measure the quality of the output, but we've made immense progress in automating translation quality evaluation, which is, the area that I do
Yeah.
understand and know quite a lot about. So progress in automated translation quality evaluation also then supports basically realistic assessment of how much work basically, the humans are actually required to do and whether they are compensated properly. In
I
general, I think.
disagree with that because I think the industry has taken some of those metrics and basically forced some discounts. But I know it's not your field. So let's go on with the
But
after
let me just say one
interactivity.
more thing. The future is, this is a famous saying, the future is already here, but it's not distributed equally. And it's
Sure.
very true of what we're talking about here. The fact that we have machine translation that can be very good, maybe even close to perfect, in certain
Yes.
language pairs, in certain domains, in certain types of texts, doesn't mean that is the state of the art across the entire reality of where people are, using this technology and adopting these processes. And the same thing is here. Even if we're going to get to this world that we just described, a new ecosystem in which translators of literature interact interactively with a highly adaptable AI system that is helping them generate translations, it's not going to work equally well across the entire spectrum. There's no question
Mm,
about that. And there's going to be a very lengthy time where to be expected that a lot of times, in the field, translators will try out these new mechanism and they'll say, I've tried it, it just doesn't work for me, right? Whether it's
sure.
because
Yeah.
of them specifically, whether it's because of the language pair, whether it's because of the specific text they're actually trying to,
The actual book.
or
Yeah.
right, the specific book, the specific domain, the specific way that they want, and their own adaptability to working with technology. All of these are going to factor in. It's going to be a lengthy process requiring adaptation and changes from both the technology side and from, to a large extent, from the community of translators doing this.
Sure. But you mentioned adaptability, interactivity, and a third characteristic, right?
Well, when I say interactivity, there's a question of like, how is this entire ecosystem kind of built? The minimal form of interactivity is like kind of a chat engagement between an
Mm-hmm.
automated AI system and a translator in this case, where you're talking with one particular agent and instructing him, maybe, as I said, you start by asking it to generate a few paragraphs and then you give it some feedback and it generates. But the world is opening, into this ecosystem of multi-agent AIs that are each very, very specialized and specifically specialized to do many different things. And there's a question of how the human experts actually interact with that entire ecosystem. So maybe, for
Mm,
example, there'll be one agent that is learning to do the translation itself, and there'll be another agent that actually is right behind the first agent and is there to critique and, you know, provide quality evaluation and quality feedback automatically on the work of the first agent. And maybe those two agents actually initially go back and forth several times without the need for the human translator to give explicit feedback, or maybe the human translator is just observing the interactions between those two agents and then interjecting at certain points for, basically it's a completely wild west in a sense. We don't
yeah.
quite know when we have multiple automated agents that are specialized for very, very specific things, how they're going to interact with each other and how they're going to actually interact with a specialized human professional such as a translator.
When you were saying this, I was thinking in my mind what I would like a machine to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I would like, if I am translating a novel, I would like maybe, I'm making this up as we go along,
Yep.
to look at all the cross-cultural references and extract them and maybe look what they are, if they're names of buildings or
Exactly.
things like this, and look to see if there is an equivalent in the language that I'm translating to. And then I will like, a super duper dictionary that will give me a lot of synonyms so I can play with it. So I think the way translators and professional literary translators think about what technology can do and what the
Yeah.
way technology is evolving sometimes is quite different. And I wonder, I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to ask you, do you think that people making the technology should look more at the way translators work or what they need? Or do you think that technology should be working as it has been for a while into basically replacing translators to save costs? What do you think is our role in all this technology development?
I think the role of translators is going to change dramatically in this new world and new ecosystem. There's no question about it. But there's a question of like, who's supposed to basically, lead that transformation and how that transformation is going to go about. I'm a believer of incorporating, in this case, the translators are the experts. So incorporating the knowledge and the capabilities of the experts as intimately and as much as possible into any further development of the technology. Will that actually happen in practice, by developers of technology is not guaranteed for sure.
No, even computational linguistics, when, or people that develop some of these
Yeah.
agents, yeah, there is not much interest in translation studies or even talking to translators. And I have always wondered, well, you came to our podcast, so I shouldn't be saying this to the converted,
Yeah.
but why do you think this is?
I think some level of ignorance about what is needed and from the people developing the technology and maybe diverging incentives basically that I think in the past and maybe even as I said, a lot of these things are kind of like an open sky even now about like these multi-agent kind of interactive
Hmm.
approaches. When it's technologically very difficult to actually incorporate the feedback of the experts, there is a tendency to just simplify and make shortcuts. That's just the way
Okay.
technology works. And in the past, I would say, particularly with translation, which is a very creative and nuanced field, it was almost impossible to get technology to really implement and adapt to many of the desired, things that translators might have basically been giving as feedback. And so basically, you can't solve the impossible. So when you can't solve the
Mm.
impossible, you simplify and you try to solve the possible. But I think we're in a world in which the frontier of what's possible is expanding in a way that we are just unfamiliar with. It really is. We've never been in a situation like this.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, so I would really encourage translators, one, to keep an open mind, but to actually be open to contributing much more broadly and much more in nuanced ways to the development of these technologies over the next few years. I suspect, and again, I don't really know, it's kind of like trying to read, a crystal ball, but we already know that there are basically big tech companies focusing on the development of what's called the frontier models now and on like just enhancing the overall capabilities, particularly now in very detailed reasoning capabilities and really kind of the overall intelligence of these foundation models. Then there's basically users of the technology. And in our case, translation, translators and actually the companies and entities that are responsible for actually doing translation work. And then there's middle ground technology developers that are there really to specialize and build technology that really does actually work on very, very specific applications. The boundaries between those kind of three entities are fluid and shifting now, but I think it's going to be the responsibility of these middle application-oriented technology developers to really work with translators now. So, like companies that are specifically language translation technology companies have to transform themselves really dramatically in order to fulfill a function that only they can fill in this new world
Mm.
and work with translators and human experts in a way that they have not worked with before for the reason that I think we discussed.
Yeah. So I was wondering because the reality is, and like I say, not the future, but the now, that a lot of translators are leaving the field. A lot of students do not want to study translation. And it's sometimes in literary translation, the cohort is older because younger
Yeah,
people are not getting into this field.
right.
And I was wondering, what is your view on that? If there are less, okay, or are we going to lose an expertise? And would you tell somebody, a future translator, what they should learn or to focus on, or you would just say, well, don't study translation? What is your view?
I think we need to transform the way we educate translators that are entering the field. We need to, adopt quickly emerging technology and emerging capabilities, but there's no question that they're going to still be deeply needed. But interacting with technology, I think, as I said, in different new ways. I, th this problem is not unique just to translators.
Yeah,
Like in software development and engineering, I
yeah,
think it's even more at our doorstep, even already today, where the
yes,
same kind of challenges, if you don't actually teach software developers to write software the way they have been doing, for the last 20 years, which has been largely without the help of AI. How do you get, senior software developers that actually know how to do software architecture and build very complex systems and supervise the process of software development? And indeed, now, we're already in a world in which AI is going to be writing most of the actual computer
code.
code.
Yeah,
And so the same question, should you actually then, you see already reduced enrollment in computer science and in software engineering and software development, and they're the same types of risks. But for translators, I think it's a very similar problem. I think we need to find ways to continue attracting translators and training them to be very specialized translators. But, as part of that training, we have to continue training them how to do things mechanically or manually, the old-fashioned way, so that they actually know and understand and develop the ability to work with technology from an expert point of view and not a novice point of view.
what I think we are trying to do, at least here in Groningen, is try to preserve the core skills of translation while
Right.
at the same time giving quite a broad view on technology, so they are
Hmm.
aware how
Yeah,
it works, right?
indeed.
But it is not an easy balance, and I guess for computer science it's also not a very easy
That's
balance
right.
to strike, right?
Absolutely.
So this is a podcast to give visibility to translators. So how do you think translators can become more visible in this very AI-oriented world?
I think there's needs to be, there's multiple players again in this entire ecosystem, and they all need to actually become more collaborative or more willing to collaborate with other entities in the space. So I think, as I said, I think there's a special role for applied technology developers in this new ecosystem that leverages AI technology to incorporate linguistic experts and translators in the new technology that they develop. And for that, they're going to have to basically partner with existing entities in the industry, such as LSPs and with translator communities. And I think that's going to happen, but needs to be encouraged to happen in very specialized fields more than others. I think there are parts of the industry that are already much more commercialized and sort of industrialized and will continue to be so. So, like for translating of technical materials, I think in just the next few years, we're going to move into a world in which humans are involved in very, very little or
I think
much
we are
more.
there in
Yeah.
many cases
In
already,
many
right?
cases, we are indeed already
Yeah,
there.
we are
There are,
there.
still like domains in which, there's a high risk and, very sensitivity to even, a critical mistake, even if it's very, very rare or unlikely to happen. It's just the risk there is so great, in terms of, harm to patients again, in medical types of domains, or financial domains where getting a financial number wrong has potentially, very big financial implications, things of that nature. And the role of basically humans or experts in that area is going to be very different. It's going to be about how to make sure that catastrophic mistakes are flagged and then human reviewed so the risk is as minimal as possible. Then, in much more creative types of content, the role for the translator experts is going to be still significantly broader, but there's going to be a balancing of, again, scale, So in marketing materials, which I think are highly scalable, there's a lot of content that is marketing in nature. There's going to be a different balance between experts in marketing, maybe involving not just even translators, but just marketing experts in target languages in the process of producing marketing content. And then much more going back to literary translation and literature is going to have a different level of engagement in translators. But you ask, how do translators themselves get themselves involved? I think there'll be specialized providers, including the publishers in this case, that will, gradually see the need to involve expert translators in literature
Mm,
translation in the technology that they develop and they adopt from
yeah.
technology developers. We'll see how this works
We'll
out.
see because
Yeah,
we have done several studies and translating from scratch. So from gives a lot of happiness and pleasure because
yes,
in literature, because you're engaged in this creative process. And I'm not so sure that, just
right.
correcting or being part of this ecosystem gives the same satisfaction for the price that you're paid. But anyway, we will see.
Yeah, we will
Thank
see.
you so much, Alon. I am
Oh,
aware
my
of
pleasure.
time, and it has been so interesting to see from your point of view what the developments are. And I think it will be very interesting to our audience. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the conversation, and thank you, and glad to be here.
Thank you again to our invited speaker and to our listeners. Thank you for being there and feel free to share our podcasts with your family, friends, and colleagues. This is part of a series of podcasts of the EU-funded INCREC project. So follow us for more episodes and please share your comments on this platform. See you next time.